Excellent. You've got a nice Coke to keep you awake all night.
I've got massive amounts of caffeine if I was not constantly drugging myself, I would lose the capacity to speak very quickly.
Oh, okay. My best friend over here, he used to talk about the times where his father would buy a can of Coke and he would open it, he would empty it out onto the pavement and then he would fill it up with beer so he could drink it while he was driving around.
Oh wow, my dad would regard that as like wimpish. He would fill it with vodka. So
yeah.
I like that.
Where in Florida are you?
Orlando, just outside Orlando.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he's over there. He went over there in Florida for the son because of the mentality, like you wanted to have a gun,
like politics.
The politics. No,
I like the culture. There's lots of culture in Orlando, and the politics are just what I'm used to. So
you're obviously joking, man. He's just.
I always feel a bit self-conscious when they filmed in my flat. Because do you remember that poor Australian politician, Pauline Hanson? She was a terrible person, but she once did an interview like this, and behind her, she was kind of right-wing politician. She had just 2 books of Hitler's speeches, and someone noticed, and it caused this big scandal, and it basically destroyed her political career. So I'm trying to figure out what people could see about my flat.
Yeah, I'm looking back. You're into weed and you want to go to Palestine.
Exactly, it's not great, is it? And my skanky washing, but never mind. It's got.
For fuck's sake, man! I think you're part of the club.
T-shirt when there's all that shit going on behind.
Exactly. Like crack and exactly. It'd be perfect.
I think you don't change anything. I think you're right at home, my friend.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So, man, Johann Hari, you are a journalist and writer, and you have wrote this. Magnificent. Can we read that? Well, of course we cannot read that. It's in the opposite direction. Shit. Can you read this thing?
No, it isn't. It's chasing.
No?
I can read it. It's not mirrored.
For me, it's mirrored. For fuck's
sake. Is that Elton John? Elton John that said it's stunning.
It is. I'm proud to say this is the only book in all of human history that has ever been praised by both Elton John and Noam Chomsky.
Is it really? I tried. Is it the Elton John or is it Elton John from down the road?
No, it's the Elton John. Fuck you. Is it Elton John down the road? Fuck off. I wanted to get him and Chomsky to sing like a duet in honour of the book, but Chomsky wasn't up for it. So yeah, it would have been beautiful.
Chomsky's such a wuss. Yeah.
For fuck's sake, man! Don't insult my hero.
Don't diss Chomsky.
I've only ever read one Chomsky book, actually. I found it a little bit dry. But
which one?
Oh God, I've got to go back about 25 years. I can't remember, but
when you were 60 at this time.
About 60, yeah. But obviously, he was a big influence. Him and Gregory Bateson on the formation of NLP with the linguistic side of it. So no, I do like Chomsky. I do like his political beliefs. Not that I should comment on that. Sorry.
Can we go back to
Elton John and Chomsky? That's a marriage made in heaven.
Exactly. That's a threesome every man wants.
Yeah. Well, even though there's only 2. Oh, every man. Yeah. You're
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
If you add a man, then you've got 3.
Mm.
I would like to point out that I do not actually want to have a Chomsky Elton John 3-way. That would
I was just like,
that would be really strange. Okay, I like the look on your face, Olivia. Was just look of puzzled horror and revulsion.
I'm trying to do.
Sorry, so trying to introduce my fucking book. Hold the book up. Say it.
I'm the worst to do intros, man. I'm the very, very worst. So he's
right.
Absolutely, you'll have the worst experience with me introducing my book. So don't expect any sales from this podcast, by the way. But only for the fun, man. Okay. So this is a fucking brilliant book, right?
Stephen Fry as well. Sorry, I've just seen it. Holy shit! I mean, we're talking some intelligentsia here.
So Johann, you just realized that I'm the only one who read this book, by the way, because it's
that's the 2 of us.
Because it's just discovering the cover right now, So that's okay. So I was blown away by this book, Johann. Your book is just amazing. It's a page turner. It's really brilliant work. That's it. That's all that I want to say. This is
We've just summed up why Olivier isn't a novelist or a writer himself. It's brilliant. It's just a brilliant work. That's why he doesn't write books himself.
To be fair, Chomsky's fucking clever and has written loads of books, and that's basically what he said. So, yay!
Oh, okay. My mistake. My bad then.
Sorry, Stephen Fry said brilliant over there as well. So I'm just quoting Stephen Fry.
Yeah,
So.
but you didn't say it 7 times though.
No, because, really it touched me. This book touched me. I was hungry sometimes. I was just like sad to tears sometimes. I was really, cheering for everything what would happen. And it's a shame for your team that you didn't read it, because it's fucking brilliant. Again, that's the 8th time that I said it. So every time that if you enjoy this podcast, for once listen to us. For once, just buy this book without your eyes closed. It's brilliant. Anyway, so
I
time.
don't think we said the name of the book though, did we? Should we say the name?
Chasing the Scream.
Yeah, the subtitle is it's called Chasing the Scream: The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Thanks, Olivier. That's really nice of you to say all that. I really appreciate that.
Okay, so by the way, we didn't say the name of the book. By the way, we didn't say it. No, we didn't say it. So fine.
I'm hyper vigilant of that because my publisher always tells me off if I don't. So like one of the things they train you to do is they say, so keep repeating the name of the book throughout the interview.
Chasing the Scream.
Exactly.
Chasing the Scream.
If you watch Matrix, I go like, as I say in Chasing the Scream. So like, I'm going to try and talk myself out of that because I've started doing it at like parties and things as well. When you get into this like horrific like routine of just endlessly talking about your book, you end up just like a mental patient, just reciting certain points.
Yeah. Fuck me, chasing the scream.
Wait, who told you that I say that?
Well,
how did you know?
It was a friend. It was a friend of a friend. Yeah,
so, by the way, Johann, you did so many interviews. You did so many interviews about this book. So, what is the question that you wouldn't like us to ask you, because you did it so many times, and every time they ask you the same thing. So
yeah, I get sick of the same questions.
Yeah,
it's interesting, right? There's the cultural differences are quite interesting. So I was just in France to talk about the French version of the book, Brimard des Stupes. It was like I said, I'll get them to send you a copy, Olivier. But and I think the cultural differences in the things that people ask about are really interesting. So in France, they tended to ask quite abstract questions that I just never know how to answer. So like one of them was like the first interview. First question was, so it's a book about the war on drugs, obviously, and how and what really caused, why the war on drugs started, what really causes addiction, how to end the war on drugs. It's a journey that I went on for 30,000 miles. One of the first questions, in one of the French interviews was, sorry, I'm going to do a really bad French accent. I apologise if it's offensive to you, but
I could do it if you want.
No, be offensive.
It said, is love a drug? And I was just like,
damn, that was my. I've got to cross that off my list now. That was my first question.
That's typically French, man.
And they just wanted to keep going to abstraction, keep going. So I would like talk about, I don't know, how Portugal decriminalized all drugs and it had this incredible effect in the story. And then somebody just said, but what is a drug? What is a drug?
Yeah.
I like that. I like my people. I like these people, see? Yeah, just fuck you in your brains, you fuck up your brain. That's true.
Constant any nation that could revere Jean-Paul Sartre, right? It's not a nation with Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the worst human beings who's ever lived, right? I don't want to alienate all your French listeners, but
let's.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Weirdly, so it's interesting to see the difference between the US and Europe, for example. So there's almost every European who's interviewed me has picked up on a story in the book and asked about it, and literally no American interviewer but one has asked about it. So this is going to start in a really grim place for your listeners who don't know what the book's about.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
It's a story of a woman called Marsha Powell. I know you know about this, Olivia. I'll just tell Tim that. So I wanted to look at. So we had a lot of addiction in my family. One of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I went on this long journey to try to understand what really causes addiction, why we have a war on drugs, why it started, why it continues. And I went to loads of different places. And I wanted to go to somewhere, obviously it began in the US, it's most intense in many ways, it's most intense in the US, not in every way. And I wanted to, one aspect of the story I wanted to tell was about prisoners and prisons. And I knew that Arizona had bad prisons, and there was a link to someone else in the story about the start of the war on drugs to the prisons in Arizona. So I went to rocked up in Arizona without much sense really of anything, just thinking, well, I'll find out what's going on there. And I spoke to this woman called Donna Leone Ham, who's basically the only person who campaigns for prisoners' rights in Arizona. And I asked her this question that I ask everywhere I go, which is, tell me about something that shocked you in the time you've been doing this work. She went through this big long list, and then somewhere down the line she said, like really long way down the list, like 8th or 9th, she said, there was the time they put that woman in a cage and cooked her. That was quite bad. And then she carried on. And I was like, sorry, Donna, can we go back a second? They put a woman in a cage and cooked her. Basically, not much was known about this until I went and investigated it. But basically, there's a woman called Marsha Powell. She was a chronic crack and meth addict. And she kept being busted either for having crack and meth, using crack and meth, or for prostituting herself to get crack and meth. And one morning she woke up in a prison in Arizona, and she was suicidal. And this is a woman who, by the way, the courts had judged to be completely mentally incompetent. They said she had to have a responsible adult when there was ever any legal decision being made. She was profoundly mentally unwell. And the psychiatrist on duty to shut her up, they took her and they put her in this I guess in France or Britain, it'd be called like a holding cell, basically. It's like where they put you when they check you in. But this is Arizona, it's the desert. It's an open cage in the desert, right? Uncovered. And by law, you're only allowed to put someone there for 45 minutes because it's the desert. And they put her there and they left her there. And what happened next depends on whether you believe the prisoners who were there, some of whom I interviewed, or whether you believe the prison officers. Prisoners say they mocked her, they jeered at her. The prison guards say they forgot she was there, although it's like a few feet away from where they were. So that does not seem very plausible. I'm phrasing myself carefully for legal reasons. Either way, she shat herself, she screamed, and eventually she collapsed. When they finally called an ambulance, she had been cooked. This is I'd say the shocking thing about this case. That's not the shocking thing. I mean, all that's shocking, obviously. Here's the really shocking thing. No one was ever criminally punished for what happened to Marsha Powell. And the reason is because addicts' lives don't matter. We have dehumanized people with addiction problems to such an extent that you can brazenly murder them while they're in state custody. And we just don't give a shit. I then went and tracked down the people who'd known Marsha Powell. The story of her life is actually kind of amazing. And the humanity of who she was is I think, an amazing story. But to me, that tells you so much about where we've got to. And what's interesting, the reason I mention it I would never normally start an interview by talking about that, but in terms of cultural differences, loads of Europeans ask me about that. And they go, my God, that's the most shocking part of the book. And no Americans have yet. And I must have done 200 American interviews. And I find that really interesting. I don't know if it's just that in the US, the prison system is so horrific that people are just numbed to the stories of horror. So, for example, the prison population of the United States is so massive, largely but not entirely due to the war on drugs. And rape is so endemic in those prisons. The US today is almost certainly the first society ever where more men have been raped than women. Just to give you one fact, which is just like a numbing, extraordinary fact. First time ever in human history that you've had a society like that. I don't know if it's that or and obviously there's a much wider kind of brutality towards just by the state authorities in the US than in Europe anyway. I don't know, but I just find that a jarring cultural thing. So the French interviewers after they asked me stupid abstract questions that I had no answer to, did say, "Oh, they cook people in cages. Why do they do this?" Sorry, my French accent. I always sound like
no, it's not very good actually, man. You know, I should give you some tips about.
Exactly.
No, but it's okay. No, it's okay, man. No, but that's an horrific story that you just described, and now and. To be honest, I'm not sure that we are that different here in France, you know, because I've tried to see, are we that different with drug addicts? I'm not sure, you know. I'm not sure. You know, we still believe that this, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. France has the worst. For my book, I came to France, and for the French edition of my book, I wrote an extra chapter about France. France has the worst drug war in Western Europe. Excuse me.
Bless you.
I should also say, because I have a bit of a
Should
cold.
have that line of coke before.
I know. Well, this is part of the problem, right? Because I've got a bit of a cold, right?
Yeah.
If you do an interview arguing for ending the war on drugs while rubbing your nose obsessively, it looks really sinister. But
okay, put a disclaimer, then. You know, you just have a cold. That's it.
The French debate. It's not like a cold in inverted commas. I do actually have a cold. France has the worst drug war in Western Europe. It's not a coincidence that France also has the worst drug problems in Western Europe, because the drug war actually produces loads of counterproductive effects. The French drug debate is, the French drug policies and the French drug debate are absolutely fucking shocking. The that a lot of the things that distort the drug debate across the world really play out in France. So one example is racism, right? I opened the book with the story of how Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, was stalked and killed by the man who launched the war on drugs, right? And some people think that's a kind of weird place to begin the story. 1939, Billie Holiday stands on stage in New York City in Midtown, and she sings the song Strange Fruit, the great anti-lynching song. And that night she gets a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by a man called Hari Anslinger. And it basically says, stop singing this song. And it seems like a weird place to begin, because you think, well, what's that got to do with the war on drugs, right? One of the things that shocked me when I started doing the research for the part of the book that's about how all this began, which I didn't know anything about, was drugs weren't banned because someone sat down for the reasons that we think today. If you asked a random person on the streets of Paris or Orlando, why are drugs banned? They'd probably say, well, we don't want kids to use drugs and we don't want people to become addicted. That stuff barely comes up. Drugs were banned in the United States largely because of a racist hysteria. There was a belief that African Americans and Chinese Americans were kind of forgetting their place and had to be, in inverted commas, and had to be put back in their place. And Billie Holiday to Hari Anslinger, the man who launches the modern war on drugs, is a symbol of everything he thinks is going wrong with America. She's a woman with a heroin addiction because she was forcibly prostituted as a child, just like Marsha Powell, actually, the woman who was cooked in the cage in Arizona. And of course, she was an African-American woman resisting white supremacy. And he just resolves to destroy her. And I tell the story of the role he played in causing her death. And I think it tells you so much about the war on drugs. The reason I mention that in relation to France is, when I come to Paris and hang out with my friends, white people in Paris think that drugs are already decriminalized. And for middle-class Parisians, they are. Then you go to a place like Suburban, one of the banlieue, and there, people of Arab and African descent are being constantly arrested and harassed. Now, it's illegal, it's illegal in France to compile any statistics on racial disparities. So you can't prove this, but anyone who ever goes into French prisons points out the overwhelming majority of people arrested for drug offences are non-white. And so one of the things that happens with the war on drugs everywhere is that it's extremely racist. And the reason why is because you can't enforce the drug laws against everyone, right? It's impossible. Half of the population of France have broken the drug laws. Half the population of the United States have broken the drug laws. You can't arrest half the population. So what ends up happening, I tell the story in the book of an amazing woman I got to know, Leabet, who was a cop in Baltimore, who is really not a racist. She risked her life going undercover to expose the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. And yet she noticed when she was a drug cop, they only ever arrested African Americans. And, one of her colleagues, Matthew Fogg, went to their boss once and said, why don't we go to the white neighborhoods to do some drug busts? I'm pretty sure they use drugs too. And his boss basically said, yeah, but they get lawyers and they know journalists and they'll make a fuss. So we'll just go for the low hanging fruit. So even when the intent is not, clearly the intent is racist a lot of the time, but even when the intent is not racist, the effect is racist because the police are always going to go after unpopular groups. So there's partly that. Also, France has atrocious outcomes. Kids in France are 4 times more likely, teenagers are 4 times more likely to use cannabis than kids in Portugal, where all drugs were decriminalized when teenagers living today weren't even born. And of course, the way France treats addicts is atrocious. It's why you have one of the worst addiction problems. I can go into that more, but I don't want to rant. But yeah, France has, and the debate is so primitive and so based on misconceptions. Yeah,
we're still there. I think the debate is still, should we depenalize marijuana? This is where the debate of France is, and it's still a big no, by the way. Because we still have this thinking, that if marijuana will lead to stronger drugs, which is heroin, and then and
gateway bullshit.
Exactly the same bullshit stories that we've been fed as young age. And I think this is one of his benefit of a drug, is just to open your eyes and to open your eyes of what is addictions, what is drugs, and just to realize, you mentioned this name, Hari Anslinger, that this war on drugs comes from one man only, basically. This is basically what you mentioned in this book. If we have all this criminalized, very hard stand on drug, it comes from this man. So is it?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I think what it is that he's he played a crucial role, but also he's able to ride the kind of wave of his time, right? It's like he's a great surfer, but he needed a great wave. And he was brilliant at riding the kind of panics of his. So just to explain who this guy was, he takes over the Department of Prohibition in the United States just as alcohol prohibition is ending. He's a kind of government bureaucrat, and he wants to keep his department going. And he'd previously said that cannabis was not harmful. But there wasn't much heroin or cocaine use in the US at that time, and he really wants to keep his big department going. So he creates a hysteria around cannabis, a really false hysteria. There was a kid called Victor Licata in Florida, actually very close to where you are, Tim, who hacked his family to death with an axe. And Anslinger, with the kind of help of the Fox News of the day, Hearst newspapers, basically creates this hysteria saying, this boy smoked cannabis, look, this is what will happen when you smoke cannabis, you will hack your... I'm really not exaggerating, he literally says, when Frankenstein's monster bumped into marijuana on the stairs, the monster would die of fright. Like, he says loads of things like that. He was not understated. And years later, and cannabis is banned in that hysteria around the Victor Licata case. Years later, someone goes back and looks at the psychiatric files for Victor Licata. There's not even any evidence that he used cannabis. His family had serious mental health problems. They'd been told to institutionalize him a couple of years before, and they didn't. They kept him at home, and that happened. But I think what you said, Olivier, is totally right, that the thing that most surprised me in the research for, I'm going to do it, for Chasing the Scream, was...
What did you say? What did you say?
We didn't catch that.
Which one was that?
In the research for my book. One of the things that most...
It was called...
Chasing the Scream. Chasing the Scream.
Subtitle of... I've forgotten.
The first and the last days of a war on drugs. Buy this book. Buy this book.
What I want you to do is just follow me to every interview I do and just whisper into the microphone, buy the book.
Okay, no worries. We'll do that.
Excellent.
Subliminal messaging, yeah.
Exactly. I forgot what I was saying. Oh, yeah. This thing that most surprised me in my research.
Because you've done too many drugs.
Exactly. I'm addled. What can I say? It's, as we speak, I'm on a crack come down. No, the thing that most surprised me was that we've really fundamentally misunderstood what drugs and addiction are. And this really surprised me because it was... We've been told this story for 100 years now, right? It's become... The story about what... Let's think about addiction. We'll come back to drug use, but which is quite different. But if we think about addiction, right? As I mentioned, we had addiction in my family, and I had a story in my head about what had happened that I thought I had seen happen in front of me. So, if you'd said to me 5 years ago, what causes, like, say, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, it's called heroin addiction. The clue's in the name, right? Obviously, heroin addiction is caused by heroin. We think that if we grabbed the next 20 people off the street where you are in Orlando, Tim, randomly, and we injected them all with heroin every day, for a month, at the end of that, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to physically need. And at the end of it, they'd have this kind of desperate, ravenous craving for heroin. That's definitely, I literally thought I'd seen that. The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something wrong about that is in Canada, a doctor explained to me, in Canada or Britain, not actually in France, but in Canada or Britain, and certainly not in Florida, but in Canada or Britain, if I step out of this, I'm in London at the moment, about to go back to the US. If I step out onto the street and I get hit by a truck and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of a drug called diamorphine for the pain. Diamorphine is heroin. It's just the medical name for heroin, right? Anyone watching this who's got a British grandmother, if she's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother has been given lots of heroin for quite a long period of time, right? This is happening all the time in hospitals in Canada and Britain, that people are being given heroin, often for quite long periods. If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused by the chemical hooks, what should happen to all these people in hospitals? Bear in mind they'd be giving much stronger heroin than you'd ever buy from a drug dealer, because the stuff you buy from a dealer is contaminated. Most of it's actually shit. It's not really heroin.
Unless should be Prince.
Well, yeah, we'll come back. Actually, I'm happy to talk about that. But they should be becoming addicted. A significant number of them should be becoming addicted. This has been studied very carefully. Virtually nobody becomes addicted in medical context to diamorphine. And when I learned that, it seemed so weird and so contrary to everything we've learned. So what you're saying is you've got someone in a hospital bed being given lots of heroin who virtually never becomes addicted. And in the alleyway outside, someone who's a street user very often does. What's going on? The evidence for that is really robust. I did not understand it. It just seemed so weird. And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an amazing man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who has made this incredible discovery that I think really helps us to understand so much of what's going wrong and how to change it, which is, he explained to me this theory about addiction, that it's caused by chemical hooks that we all have in our heads, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers could try them at home if they feel a bit sadistic tonight. It's going to be you get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. So there you go, right? That's our story. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and looked at this experiment and said, well, hang on a minute. You put this rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing to do except use these drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of tunnels, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of friends, they can have sex, exactly, they can fuck all day, they can do whatever they want, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they obviously try both because they don't know what's in it, both the water bottles. They don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use at overdose when they're isolated and have shitty lives, to none, literally none, when they have really good lives. And there's loads of human examples I can talk about that. But just to say one other thing about it, there's a professor in Amsterdam called Peter Cohen who says we shouldn't call it addiction, we should call it bonding. Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. And when we're happy and healthy, we will bond and connect with the people around us. But if we can't do that because we're isolated or traumatized or beaten down by life, you will bond and connect with something that will give you some sense of meaning. That might be gambling, that might be porn, that might be cocaine, it might be alcohol. But we have an innate, exactly. We have an innate need to. I was wondering what that, if you, that in fact had porn on it.
Bonding right now, my friend.
Bonding. It's watching porn while.
Exactly. It's a beautiful thing to behold. Do you see? Well, that really helps you to understand why the French and American approach to the war on drugs is such a fuck up. If pain and isolation are causes of addiction, inflicting more pain and more isolation on people doesn't make them better. It actually makes them worse.
Can I? Do you remember the Leabet story?
Of course, yeah.
Well, just for anybody listening that doesn't know, Leabet was a girl, and this was at the time when I was clubbing, so it's probably got to be 20 odd years ago now. And she was a girl that took an ecstasy tablet, and then she drank about 27 pints of water or whatever. And basically, she died from a water overdose. She basically drowned her brain. And her husband, her father, Paul Betts, went on a campaign against ecstasy. And the interesting thing about it was the tabloid paper at the time, The Sun, ran this story for days on end about the evils of ecstasy. And I hope I don't ramble on too long with this story, but about a year later, a club I used to go to, Progress in Derby, there was a girl that went to it who was actually the daughter of the chief superintendent, police chief superintendent at the time. And she took ecstasy on the bus, and she collapsed on the bus on the way back home to Mansfield from Derby. And they listed her as an ecstasy death as well. And when they did the autopsy, she found she'd taken 2 strips of distillgesics and she drunk half a bottle of vodka. And the real death was the mixing of the alcohol and the distillgesics. At the time, distillgesics were a very strong painkiller and fairly easy to get hold of. And but the point I'm trying to make is every time there was any death connected with ecstasy after that, these 2 girls' pictures still cropped up, even though it was proven that they didn't really die because of the drug. I'm not saying it wasn't a factor in their death, but they didn't die from, and the point I'm trying to make is that from my small town, I used to run a record store, and there was about 50 of us. Once a month, we used to go to this nightclub that was it was more like a rave type thing. Once a month, we'd sell about 50 to 80 tickets. everybody, bar one person that I know, used to take ecstasy. And I'm in touch with still a lot of those people. Not one of them became an addict. Not one of them. It was a social thing. It was a once a month thing. We'd go out and we would get wasted and we'd party all night, and then we'd go home and we'd chill out, and then we'd go back to work the following Monday. And really just to kind of cement your point of view is that we didn't feel like we needed to do this. I'm not saying none of them, it didn't affect anybody adversely, but it's the thing that really, really bugs me is the gateway drug, which has never ever been proven that cannabis is a gateway to taking. Well, yeah, if you take cannabis, probably you're more likely to take that drug because you're more open to different experiences whatsoever. And I think that's a different thing to saying that cannabis triggers the need to take something stronger any more than reading the Daily Mail triggers the need to read the Guardian. Now, that's a terrible example. Nobody in the Daily Mail would ever read the Guardian. It's far too intelligent for them. Sorry.
No, but obviously, I think the only problem with that is that you're not a great advocate for this, because obviously ecstasy did reduce you to the broken shell of a man that we can hear before us.
Look at him.
No intelligence whatsoever.
Look at him.
Exactly.
Unable to hold a relationship together or a job down, yeah.
If you had not taken ecstasy, you would have been reading Heidegger to us now. So it's a tragic affair. No,
I wouldn't be friends with him if I hadn't taken ecstasy. I'm like desperate for friends, yeah.
Exactly, it's a tragic affair. I think you brought up loads of important things. So one of them, and this is something that's also Rat Park helps us to understand, is, and this is something that really surprised me because, as I say, it was not my family's experience at all. So 90%, we all know this about alcohol, 90% of people who use alcohol don't become addicted to it. Olivia, you're holding up your alcohol, right? You're not going to, I've got here a can of dark Pepsi.
I'm hiding mine in orange juice.
Exactly what I...
He's an alcoholic, by the way.
Exactly,
No.
so...
I'm a raving alcoholic. I've just popped an E as well, by the way, so yeah.
Perfect. It's beautiful thing to behold. This kind of surprised me that 90% of people, so we know this about alcohol, you go into a bar in Paris or Orlando tonight, look around you, you'll know there may be a very small number of people there who are alcoholics who need our love and support, but the vast majority of people are using alcohol just because it makes their life better. I was surprised by the statistics on this. I frankly didn't believe them until I went through them very robustly. That's true of all drugs. 90% of people who use crack or meth do not become addicted to crack or meth. Now, there are other health problems associated with those drugs, for sure, just like there are terrible health problems associated with alcohol. But and so you have to ask what's happening with that 10%, right? And what's happening with that 10% is not just the drug. It's the drug plus something else. I'll give you a human example. During the Vietnam War, shitloads of American soldiers, about 20%, were heavily using heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, the Nixon White House and the media were absolutely shitting themselves because they thought, my God, when the war ends, we're going to have loads of, as they would have put it, junkies on the streets of the United States. What are we going to do? And there was a study that followed these soldiers home. Very few of them went to rehab. They didn't get much support at all. They just kind of went home. And 95% of them just stopped using the drug. Now, if you believe the old theory of addiction that is you're saying that like gateway or that the drug hijacks you, it takes you over, it makes you a slave, that makes absolutely no sense. If you understand this different way of addition that I'm talking about in my book, Chasing the Scream,
what was that? Chasing the Scream.
That comes from Bruce Alexander's work, or that has been tried by whole countries that I'm happy to talk about. It makes perfect sense, right? I'm drinking Diet Pepsi, you're drinking a beer. Tim, I can't quite see what you're drinking. It looks like a disgusting yellow. Orange juice, right? Totally, forget the drug laws for a second. Totally legally, all three of us could be drinking vodka now, right? I've got vodka in my kitchen. I don't actually drink alcohol, but I've got vodka in my kitchen because when people come around, neither of you is more than 15 minutes away from getting a bottle of vodka, right? We could drink vodka now. We could drink vodka for the next 3 weeks, right? And not stop. The reason we're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping us. It's because we want to be present in our lives, because we have people we love, we've got meaning and purpose and connection. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And it really helps you to understand why, so I went to the places that have the most extreme possible forms of punishment towards addicts. In Arizona, in the prison that Marsha Powell used to be in, not the one she died in, another one, I went out with, they make women go out on chain gangs wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict, and make them dig graves while members of the public mock and jeer at them. What happens? They leave the prison and they all fucking relapse, and their addictions are made worse because, they're even more traumatized than they were going in. And I went to the places that did the exact opposite, and we can see the results. So, for example, Portugal, in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of incredible. And it's mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And every year they tried the American way and the French way more. They arrested and I didn't mean to point to you when I said the French way, as if you are the representative of all French people. But they arrested and they imprisoned more people every year. And every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on like this. What are we going to do? And they decided to do something really radical, something no one had done since before Harry Anslinger. They said, should we get some scientists to look at the evidence and figure out what would actually stop this? No one had done that. Drug policy had not been based on talking to any scientists for a really long time. So they set up this panel led by this amazing man I got to know called Dr. João Goulão. And they basically said, you guys go away, figure out what would actually solve this, and come back, and we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So they went away, they looked at all the evidence, including some of the stuff we've been talking about, and they came back and said, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on making life harder for drug users and drug addicts, and spend it instead on giving the drug users, 90% of people who use drugs who don't have a drug problem, health advice, exactly the kind of things that Leabet should have known and didn't, like, she was told you need to drink water. She didn't realise you shouldn't sit down and just compulsively drink water. So giving health advice to the 90% who don't have a problem, and for the 10% who do have a problem, giving them really intensive help to turn their lives around. And what's interesting is it's not really what we think of as drug treatment in Britain and the US. So they do some residential rehab, they do some therapy. The biggest thing they do is the opposite of what we do. We give addicts criminal records, we stigmatise and shame them, we put barriers between them and reconnecting with the society. In Portugal, what they did is set up a massive programme of job creation for addicts. If you used to be a mechanic, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. They set up a huge program of microloans so addicts could set up and run small businesses about things they believed in. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 13 years since this experiment began. It's 15 years now. The results were in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal by 50%, 50%. Overdose deaths were massively down. HIV was massively down. All forms of death among drug users were massively down. And drug use by teenagers remained at the same level. And I think, so it didn't increase because of the decriminalisation. And one of the ways it worked so well is I went and interviewed a guy called João Figueira. He's an amazing man. He led the opposition to the decriminalisation at the time it happened because he was the top drug cop in Portugal. And he said, what loads of people think when you talk about this, he said, surely if you decriminalise all drugs, we'll have a massive increase in drug problems. We'll have all sorts of problems. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt really ashamed that he'd spent 20 years before the decriminalisation arresting and harassing drug users. And he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example.
Right.
But
this is for me is I've learned about that in your book, right? I've learned
Chasing
about
the Screen.
Chasing the Screen by this book. It's a beautiful book. I've learned it. I've never heard it from anybody else, right? This result, every time that we when we hear about drug it's on the news, and it's because the cops have just taken 2 tons of drug. They just intercept a boat with 2 tons of heroin on it. It's just this constant war on drugs here. Nobody will tell you need to decriminalize. Nobody. But at least in France, in the common news. So why is that?
Can I add a point to that? Did they decriminalise or legalise?
So I'm glad you asked that. It's a really important question because Portugal, it's important to understand Portugal solved one set of problems, but not another. So the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation is decriminalisation is where you stop punishing drug users, but they have to go to armed criminal gangs to get their drugs still, right? Legalisation is where you open up some legal route for them to get their drug, which means different things for different drugs. So decriminalisation shuts down Orange is the New Black, and legalisation shuts down Breaking Bad. And what they did in Portugal is they decriminalised, but they didn't legalise. And it's important to talk about that because I actually think the biggest... Obviously, the reason I came into this story is because of the addiction in my own family, and what we do to drug users and drug addicts is very close to my heart and is monstrous. But actually, the worst aspect of the global war on drugs, and this is playing out catastrophically in France at the moment, actually, but playing out all over the world, it is something else entirely. And it's the violence caused by prohibition. Right. So I learned about this, a lot of it, from two people I spent a lot of time with for the book. One was Chino Hardin, who's a transgendered crack dealer in Brooklyn, who is one of the wisest people I know. And the other was a guy called Rosalio Reta, who was a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, the Zetas, who, between the ages of 13 and 17, butchered or beheaded about 70 people. He's now in prison in Texas. But I went to Juarez and northern Mexico to see the catastrophe that's happening there, and I interviewed him in prison in Tyler County in Texas. But so to explain that to people, because often, and this is particularly true in the French debate, there was a disgusting piece in Le Figaro the other day about this. So you often hear the phrase drug-related violence, right? And what people picture when they hear that phrase is someone using drugs, losing the plot and attacking someone, which does sometimes happen. It's been studied, that's about 3% of what gets called drug-related violence. About another 7%, is that right, 7%? It's less than 10% anyway. Another very small fraction is where someone with an addiction problem is committing a property crime to feed their habit and gets caught and they end up committing violence. The rest of it, so the overwhelming majority of what's called drug-related violence, is something else entirely. And to understand that, as I say, I learned it from these people and I tell their stories in the book, but the best way to understand it, you guys can do a little experiment. Is it less dangerous than the one we're giving rats heroin? Probably a bit more dangerous, but anyway, you can try it if you want. Just go into a shop, go into a liquor store and try to steal a bottle of vodka or a bottle of wine, right? If that store catches you, they'll ring the police and the police will come and take you away. So that store doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. They've got the power of the law to uphold their property rights. Okay, once you've done that, go and try to steal a bag of weed or a bag of coke. If the guy in your neighbourhood who sells that catches you, obviously he can't ring the police, right? The police would come and arrest him. He has to fight you. Now, he doesn't want to be having a fight every day. So he has to establish a reputation for being such a badass that no one would be so stupid as to fuck with him, right? Now, he has to establish his place in that neighbourhood by fighting off his rivals, and he has to maintain his place in that neighbourhood through violence against his rivals. The war on drugs creates a war for drugs. Right. Now, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, calculated there are 10,000 additional murders every year in the United States as a direct result of that dynamic. The reason why Marseille is now the most dangerous city in Western Europe is because the war for drugs is playing out on its street. I remember when Manuel Valls went to, it only gets in the news every now and then because the Prime Minister went there, and there happened to be a drug fight with Kalashnikovs in a few streets down, and they thought it was a terrorist attack, and it was just it was just dealers killing each other, and they were like, oh well, who cares, and if you want to understand how much of that violence is caused by prohibition, ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers today? Does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face? Do the people who sell Guinness up the road?
I wish the head of Smirnoff would shoot the head of Heineken in the face, so we didn't have to put up with Heineken. That would be nice. Because Heineken, this sounds like The Wire. Have you seen The Wire?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, it's just... sorry, go on.
I think you're totally right. Everyone knows who Al Capone and Pablo Escobar is, and no one knows who the head of Guinness is or the head of Coors, right? Because we don't care, because it's a legal trade, and you can now that's bad enough. It's catastrophic enough in Marseille. It's actually I know you're near Miami, Tim. Well, not that far from Miami. Yeah. I mean, Miami has been, particularly in the 80s, devastating drug war battleground. It's bad enough in Miami or Marseille. If you go to Colombia or Mexico, as I did, more people have died in Mexico in the drug war violence in the last 8 years than have died in Syria by some estimates. And you compare how much we talk about Syria, quite rightly we should, to to how little we talk about northern Mexico, where we could end that violence. And some of Marsha Powell, the woman who was cooked in the cage, I thought was going to be the grimmest story that I learned about from the book. It wasn't. Getting to know this hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, getting to know the story of a woman in Juarez who was searching for her daughter and couldn't find her, and what happened next. Those two stories of the things that really haunt me.
Don't haunt us.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. I mean, because I actually heard a stat recently. There was Anthony Bourdain. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was interviewing one of the few people in Mexico that stood up against the cartels. This woman, and she was in secret, and she was moving from house to house, and she was a politician or whatever, and she was saying basically the corruption goes right the way up to the prime minister in Mexico, and it's and beyond. I don't know how you go beyond the prime minister, but they were saying that there were more people killed in the drug wars in Mexico than all the US troops since Vietnam combined to now. So all the troops killed, in Afghanistan and Iraq or whatever, there were more people killed in Mexico or disappeared in Mexico.
It'd be way more than that. So there's a shocking moment when Michelle Leonhardt was the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, until a few months ago. And she was asked when she was testifying before the Senate about the 60,000, this is the figure they put to her, it was too low, 60,000 people who died or disappeared in Mexico in a result of the drug war. That's what she thought about that. And she said, these were her exact words, "It's a sign of success in the war on drugs," she said. Which really, but what you're saying really reminds me of, I think one of the most, there's a lot of upbeat stories in the book and a lot of really inspiring stories, I hope. But
which book's that?
I don't know. It's
I have no idea.
What you just said about Mexico, really, there was this, in the year 2000 in Juarez, which is the city obviously on the Mexican side of the border with Texas, there was a woman called Marisela Escobedo who was a nurse, and she had she was a very hard-working woman, Marisela, and she had a woodwork store. She would make like wooden things and sell them at the weekends. And one day no one in her family ever used drugs or sold drugs or had anything to do with the drug trade. One day, she was at her market store, and a guy came up to her, a young guy called Sergio, who was 21 or 22 at that time. And he kind of, said, "Oh, I really need a job." He gave a bit of a sob story, and she was a very nice person. So she said she gave him a job. And a couple of months later, she found out that he was having sex with her 14-year-old daughter, Ruby. She was obviously horrified, and she fired him. And she found out he was still having sex with her daughter. So she went to the police and said, "Look, you've got to deal with this. This guy's, he's a 20-year-old fucking a 14-year-old. And the police didn't do anything, and she didn't understand why. And her daughter kept running away. She kept going to the police. The police still did nothing. In the end, her daughter actually got pregnant by this guy, and Marisela was obviously heartbroken and kept running away to be with him. And just after the baby was born, Ruby was basically living with Sergio. And one day, Marisela went to see her daughter, and the baby was there. Sergio had the baby, but he said, "Oh, Ruby's run away with another man. She's not here. And she's not coming back." She said she's never coming back. And Marisela said, "What? She ran away and left her child?" "No, I know my daughter, she didn't do that." And he said, "Well, she's gone." And Marisela waited to hear from her daughter. She waited through Christmas and New Year and her birthday, and she didn't hear anything. She started to go to the neighbourhood where Ruby had been living with Sergio. She started just handing out leaflets saying, "Have you seen this girl?" with a picture of her. And after a couple of weeks, a boy called Angel, rang her and said, "I know what happened to your daughter." He was terrified. She had to drive him out into the desert before he would tell her. But he said, "Sergio murdered your daughter, and he made me help him dispose of the body. I can tell you where the body is." So she went to where this boy said, and Ruby's body was there, the remains of her body. And the police went and they arrested Sergio. And Sergio was put on trial. And Sergio, in the witness box, broke down, admitted what he'd done, and apologised to Marisela. And 3 weeks later, he was mysteriously acquitted of all charges and disappeared. And that's when Marisela found something out, that he was a member of the Zetas, one of the most notorious drug gangs. And exactly what you say about the corruption, 70% of the economy of Ciudad Juarez is in the drug trade, right? Because very little of it is for the actual domestic use. It's just as a transit route to the United States. If you've got 70% of the economy, you can pay higher wages than the government. You can outbid the state. So the police work for the Zetas. Rosalio, the hitman for the Dos Mexican drug cartel, who I got to know, you know, when he would go and butcher people, the police would come and dispose of the body afterwards. So Marisela refused to accept she lived in a society like this, right? Lots of women were going missing in Juarez at that time, because it turns out if men can just murder women and there's no legal consequences, quite a lot of them who are members of these drug cartels will do it. She refused to accept she lived in a society where that could happen. So she turned herself into a detective. She teamed up with loads of other mothers whose daughters were disappearing. And she spent 2 years tracking Sergio across Mexico. This band of mothers whose daughters had disappeared would walk through the desert for hundreds of miles to track this man. And after 2 years, incredibly, Marisela found him in the middle of the Zeto heartland as she went to the police, and the police let him away again. So she walked through the desert over 800 miles to Chihuahua, the state capital, and she gave this amazing speech outside the state capital, outside the governor's mansion, in which she said, "I'm not leaving here until you go and arrest this man." And she urged every mother who had a daughter who was missing, who was afraid for their daughters, to come and join her. And she set up this camp, and it became a huge news story in Mexico, and it became a real focus of the resistance to the corruption and to the drug war violence. And one day she gave another great speech, and a man walked up to her in front of all the police and all the cameras and shot her in the head. And I got to know her story from her kids who now live in hiding in, well, I'm not meant to say where, in a place in the United States. And to me, Marisela's story, you know, I went in one of her best friends, one of the women who marched through the desert with her, is a woman called Berta Alicia Garcia. And I went to see her in her shack in Juarez, and I said to her, weren't you frightened? And she said, of course we were terrified, but sometimes your love for your children is stronger than your fear. And that really stayed with me. And to me, Marisela's story, the biggest victims of the war, there are many people being killed by the war on drugs. There are, you know, all the people are going to be shot in Marseille this week. There's all the people are going to die of overdoses in Orlando this week. There's catastrophes. But the violence along the supply route countries is, I think, the most, of many horrors, it's the worst. And we could completely end it. No one is being killed for alcohol, to control the alcohol trade in Chicago today. Huge numbers of people died when it was prohibited. This is the product. And it's important to say as well that legalization means different things for different drugs, right? In the same way that, you know, it would be legal for me here in London to go and buy a dog, a monkey, and a lion. They're all legal, but they're all legal in a different way, right? So, you know, a dog, I can just go into a store. A monkey, I think I'd need a license. And for a lion, like...
Yeah, don't put the lion with the monkey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, actually, if you had seen the documentary The Lion King, with the songs written by Elton John, you would know that they would become close friends.
What book did he like? What was the latest book that he recommended, Elton John, by the way?
He said stunning. Elton John said stunning.
Stunning.
That was actually
Chasing the Scream.
To be honest, he was just talking about my face, but nonetheless...
he does
exactly. I would, in the same way. Sorry, I big went off at the tangent there. In the same way, I'm in favour of legalising all drugs, but it's important to say that means different things for different drugs, right? And there's nothing abstract about what that means, because I've been to the different places that have tried it. So, for example, cannabis can be legalised like alcohol. You know, so over-the-counter sale to adults with serious punishments for people who sell to non-adults. There are different models of that. Colorado, it's been commercial legalization. You've got to be over 21. It's a, you know, for-profit store. That's a lot better than what we have now. It wouldn't be my preferred model. My preferred model would be what they have in Spain, some parts of Spain, where it's a not-for-profit cooperative that, you know, that does it. I wouldn't. So they can't advertise. You can't promote the drug, but you can get it legally. Obviously, very few people are in favour of over-the-counter sale of heroin. Switzerland legalised heroin for addicts. So I went there to see how that works. And it's a very different model. So Switzerland had a really big heroin problem. And Ruth Dreifuss, the president of Switzerland at the time, who's one of the most amazing people I know, just an extraordinary person, she explained to people in Switzerland, look, when you hear the phrase legalisation, what you picture is anarchy and chaos. What we have now with prohibition is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, chaos, and disease. Legalization is the way we restore order to that anarchy. So what they did is if you're a heroin addict, you're assigned to a clinic rather. You go to that clinic. I went to the one in Geneva. You go into the clinic. You're given your heroin there by a nurse. You can't take it out with you. You have to use it there. And then you use it and you leave and you go to your job, because almost everyone, they give them support to get housing and jobs. They turn their lives around. One of the interesting things about that program, and it really goes back to what we said before about addiction, you can stay on that program as long as you want. There's never any pressure to cut back. And yet almost everyone reduces their dose and stops over time. And I asked Rita Mangi, the psychiatrist who runs the Geneva Clinic, why is that? And she said to me, basically, well, it's because their lives get better. And as your life gets better, you want to be present in your life more. You don't want to be fucked up so much. The most important statistic about the legal heroin in Switzerland, do you know how many people have died of overdoses on legal heroin in Switzerland in the decade they've been doing this?
Give me say 0, no?
Literally not a single person. You compare that to, I think it's 29 people a day at the moment in the United States or in the heroin crisis. I'm about to go to New Hampshire, which is the epicenter of the catastrophe.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting you mentioned New Hampshire, because I was listening to a documentary on BBC World News recently, and how in New England in general, but New Hampshire, where it's the suburban rise of heroin, where it's completely destroying entire villages and towns, and they just don't know how to cope with it. It's not like, everybody thinks it's an inner city urban problem, and now it's spread out to the, I can remember when I was brought up, I lived in Matlock in Derbyshire, which you may know, and that went from an ecstasy town to a heroin town quite quickly, and to me it was shocking. I mean, I'm glad I was probably towards my late 20s at the time and never got wrapped up in that, but it sort of changed because it was so cheap. And, rather than people paying 10 quid or £10 for an ecstasy tablet, they could buy a wrap of smack for like 3 or 4 quid. And it's, and I think a lot of people are naive to how it's infiltrating white, middle-class, suburban society, rather than just being, without wanting to appear racist, it's not a black thing anymore. Not that it ever has been just a black thing, but more and more it's becoming, it's attacking the infrastructure or the epicenter of American life, basically.
It's important to understand several things about that. So, Bruce Alexander, who did the Rat Park experiment, says we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and that's good, that's important to talk about. But we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And if you look at the places where addiction is at its worst, they are places where people have become profoundly disconnected. Now, that could be Wall Street, where people are disconnected from meaning, purpose, they don't have meaningful lives, or it can be, places that have been completely economically abandoned, where people are totally alone. There's this fascinating, you can track, there's a study that asks Americans how many close friends they have they could call on in a crisis. And it's been steadily declining ever since they started doing it. And now the most popular answer is none, which I think is extraordinary. At the same time, you can look at the average floor space in an American's home, and that's been gradually increasing. Over time. I think it tells you something about, what's happened to our values and our culture. And I say our partly because I spent a lot of time in the US and I love the US, but also because this is part of what's happened to Western culture. But so there's one thing about that, which is we have a society where a lot more people are very distressed. And as a result, a lot more people are anesthetizing themselves to get through the day. So there's partly that. And, I always think it's incredible. You see these discussions about the massive rise in addiction. When does it start to spike up massively? 2008. Well, gee, is there anything that happened in 2008 that anyone can think of that might actually, although I said that on a radio show when someone said, "You mean the election of Obama?" And I was like, no, that's not what I meant. Obama did not turn you into a crack addict. But it's incredible to me that we can discuss addiction separate to social causes in this way. It's so naive, it's so stupid that we can do that. You know, and it's worth talking about how massive the death scale is. This year, that major study this year that found this is the first year since the founding of the American Republic that average white male life expectancy has fallen, right? This is doing what the Civil War couldn't do, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? And it's because we have society where huge numbers of people are very distressed. Now, there's another thing you talked about, which I think is really important. It's slightly wonky, but I think it's really important for people to understand. And I stress again that most of the stuff in the book is about stories of people, not it's not kind of wonky stuff like this. But I think it's really important for people to understand that. So this thing called the Iron Law of Prohibition, it seems a bit weird, but it explains why you had the transfer from ecstasy to heroin in your town in Derby, and why there's this huge transfer from prescription drugs to heroin at the moment across the US. So best way to explain it is the day before alcohol was banned in the US, most popular drink by far was what Olivier's drinking there, a beer and wine, right? Today, most popular drinks in the United States by far are beer and wine. Within 2 weeks of alcohol being banned, beer and wine disappeared. And the only drinks you could get were whiskey, vodka, and moonshine. And they became obviously the most popular drinks. And they continue to be most popular drinks. And then the moment alcohol prohibition ends, we go back to... And you think, well, why would that be, right? Why would banning the drug change the kind of drug people use? It's for a very simple reason, kind of rather boring reason in a way. If you imagine... in Orlando, we had to smuggle, to you, Tim, you had to smuggle from the Mexican border all the alcohol for your nearest bar, right? And we had to smuggle it in a wagon or a truck. If we fill that wagon or truck with beer, we're going to get drink for what, like 500 people? If we fill it with vodka, we'll get enough drink for like 10,000 people. Whenever you ban a drug, you suddenly get a premium on getting the biggest possible kick into the smallest possible space because it's got to be smuggled. So this has happened with, if you look and think about cannabis, sometimes people say, well, we can't legalize cannabis because the cannabis people smoke today is not the cannabis people smoked in the 60s. It's absolutely true, and it's entirely the result of the drug war. Most people who drink alcohol don't want to drink vodka, and virtually no one drinks absinthe, even though it's legal. Most people who smoke cannabis don't want to smoke super skunk, but the only forms of cannabis that are available in a prohibited market are very potent forms. Same thing happening with, if you look at, so loads of people have become addicted to prescription opiates like OxyContin, Vicodin, right? In the US, they have the opposite of the Swiss model. In Switzerland, if you become an addict, they will prescribe you the thing you're addicted to and help you turn your life around. In the US, if your doctor finds out that you are using, not for pain relief, physical pain relief, but because you're an addict, by law they have to kick you off. If they don't, they can go to prison as a drug dealer, and lots of doctors have done that, have gone to prison as drug dealers. So they have to throw you off, and obviously you're not given any support to turn your life around. So what happens? You arrive in a prohibited market. You have to go into a prohibited market to get your drug. You have to go to drug dealers. Now, those drug dealers can sell you OxyContin or Vicodin, but it's really expensive because it's a less potent form of the drug. Or they can sell you heroin, a more potent form of the drug, which is much cheaper. And, you know, I spoke to lots of people who transferred from prescription opiates to heroin, not because they would rather have stayed on the prescription opiates, but they just couldn't afford it. In the same way that if you went into a bar tonight and beer was like $50 a bottle and vodka was $3, even though vodka's probably not your drink, you'd probably drink vodka instead of beer, right? So the war on drugs pushes people towards much more dangerous forms of the drug. Now, there's other reasons why the drugs become more dangerous. If they're controlled by armed criminal gangsters, obviously you can't send health and safety inspectors into the like arsehole of whoever smuggled your cocaine into the country, right? That can't happen in the way that we do inspect the beer that Olivier's drinking was inspected, and you know the place where it's done. Your beer does not contain loads of poisons in the way that often prohibited drugs do. So there's all sorts of ways in which it makes drug use radically more dangerous. Which is not to say that when you decriminalize or legalize, all these problems go away. They don't. It's important to stress that. But everywhere I went where they'd moved beyond the war on drugs, from Uruguay to Portugal to Switzerland, the problems had significantly reduced. Switzerland is a super conservative country. My dad's from there. My grandmother got the vote in 1973. This is not San Francisco, right? And yet Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal once they've seen it in practice in a referendum by 70%, which is huge margin, because they could see that it saved money, it reduced crime, it stopped people dying, and it bankrupted criminals.
My friend.
On that note.
On that happy note.
Yeah.
My friend, that was awesome, actually. We just went over the hour, and the cool thing is, I can listen to you without, just like this. We don't have to ask you any question. Like, we can see the passion behind this.
Have you ever heard me so quiet during an interview?
Exactly. Seriously. That's the very first time that we're just like, wow, it's so great what you just did.
Yeah.
So,
you've been doing this over a year, and I've never been as quiet as I have today.
Exactly. He will always talk about himself.
And also, I find what you're saying. I just agree with it all. So
exactly.
it's difficult to find any area where you've got holes in your argument or whatever. So I suggest to people they buy Chasing the Scream.
Chasing the Scream, the best book ever.
I think you mean Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs.
That's
Fuck you. If you didn't say the subtitle, I reject your compliment.
Really? Wow.
Exactly.
We only been friends, and right now you just...
Oh, no, I'm only joking. Thank
I'll
you so much.
Is it on Audible?
It is, yeah. It's in fact the audiobook was nominated for the big audiobook awards because the guy who read it is apparently excellent. I can't bear to ever hear anyone say my words back to me, so I haven't actually listened to it. But lots of people told me it was really good. I should just tell your listeners that if anyone wants any more information, or they can hear all my interviews with loads of different people from.
You're trying to steal our two-man traffic now, aren't you?
Exactly.
The people.
If anyone wants it, it's www.chasingthescream.com.
We will put that in the byline under the video.
We will do this.
So thanks, mate.
I really appreciate that.
I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, and probably because you confirmed what I already sort of believed. I think it's always nice, because I'm a bit liberal on the drug front, and because I've been through it myself and seen people come out the other side and not become addicts. That I get really wound up with people saying, "Oh, well, that's going to lead to this, and then it's going to lead." No, it's not. It's not. So good stuff, man.
Someone pointed out, because the last 3 presidents of the United States have all smoked cannabis, that cannabis is a gateway drug to the White House.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good.
Yeah.
Johann, thank you very much for being on this podcast, really. And if you need to come to France, to Paris, by the way, okay?
I will.
Next time, and we'll have lunch or anything.
Yeah, and you'll be shot in the head by some...
by Marseillais gangsters. Oh, anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, my friend, very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Cheers.
Cheers, Johann. Good to speak with you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.